Wild horses, wild burros, and public lands. Delicate balance to ensure the protection and preservation of all. That discussion is coming up on a special extended edition of Nevada Week.
Support for Nevada Week is provided by Senator William H. Hernstadt, Cashman Equipment, De Castro Verde Law Group, Nevada State Bank, Valley Electric Association, and additional supporting sponsors.
Well, welcome and thank you as always for joining us this week on Nevada Week. Well, wild horses, wild burros, and our public lands collectively are a big part of Nevada's living legacy. They all are a symbol of our past as much as they are a reflection of our future. But many experts believe we are nearing a tipping point that puts both wild horses and burros and the public lands that they live on in jeopardy. Wild horse and burro populations are growing fast, and our mostly arid public lands are not only delicate, but used for a large range of purposes that benefit our state, from industry to recreation to water containment. So where is that balance? What is the situation now? And what are some of the solutions? Well, that's exactly what we want to talk about on today's show. And what we want to do when we start this discussion is first watch a brief clip from the Bureau of Land Management. It gives us some background on what this issue is. Please take a look.
They are living legends of the American West. Introduced to the continent by Spanish explorers more than 400 years ago. Captured and domesticated for use by Native American tribes, then later by those who came to tame America's western frontier. Over time, many found their way to freedom on the vast open rangelands of the West. In the last 40 years, the free-roaming horses and burros have been protected by federal law. Protected so diligently, in fact, that a major threat they face is their own overpopulation. Their growing numbers now threaten the health of the herds, the health of many other species of plant and animal life, and the health of these often fragile landscapes, which support many different public uses and values. They are part of a greater mosaic, the public lands legacy that belongs to all Americans. We all have a stake in the stewardship of these magnificent animals and in the balanced management of the lands they inhabit.
And to help us answer these questions about this clip and also much more related to the topics of wild horses and burros and public lands, we are very thankful to have with us today Gus War, Wild Horse and Burro Program Manager for BLM Utah, Celeste Carlisle, Biologist for Return to Freedom, Greg Hendricks, Field Director for the American Wild Horse Campaign, and Steve Foray, Retired Regional Habitat Supervisor for the Department of Wildlife in Nevada. Thank you so much for being here. We've traveled from afar to be on this show. We really appreciate the time and you all taking the time to be here. Gus, I want to start with you. They mentioned on the clip free roaming. What is considered a free roaming horse or free roaming burro in this case?
Great question. So free roaming wild horse and burro are literally that. They are horses and burros that are found on the public lands in the western United States that literally are free. They're roaming on public lands. They're managed by the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service, but they're similar to wildlife, but they're not wildlife. They're wild horses and they're wild burros.
We hear terms like Mustang is the most common one we use here in Nevada. So is a Mustang a wild horse?
Yeah, Mustang is a common term. A Mustang is a Spanish term for wild or free horse or unclaimed horse. So.
And then for burro, we hear mule, we hear donkey. Is it the same thing and it's just a wild version or different?
You know that I hear that all the time, especially from school children I meet with. And a burro and a donkey is the same thing. We refer to them as burros because of the 1971 law, but a burro and a donkey is the same thing.
And you mentioned wildlife, Steve. I want to ask you too. There's wildlife. Elk populations, deer populations, and there's domesticated animals, and then the wild horse population is somewhere in the middle. How do you classify that then?
Well, I don't know that it's the Department of Wildlife's job to do that. I mean, I think we are charged through state directive to manage the wildlife species to perpetuate those wildlife species in the best way that we can. And so, yeah, so we do interact with the BLM and the Forest Service in terms of habitat management to the benefit of wildlife species, but we don't oftentimes get in the fray of trying to identify, what a wild horse is.
But essentially, you don't consider them
considered
wildlife.
wildlife.
They're kind of their own entity.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Celeste, let's talk a little bit about the history. It was mentioned a little bit in the clip. They really came from Spanish, but I did a little bit of digging, and I found that the horses are somewhat native to our continental North America, South America as well, and then kind of became extinct and then came back with the Spanish coming over. So how do you then classify a horse, if that's the case, as a native animal to a non-native animal?
Technically, they can be called a reintroduced native wildlife species, but that is, that's in the works, I would say. They evolved on this continent, on what is now the United States, 55 million years ago. The little dawn horse was here and continued its evolutionary story throughout many hundreds of thousands and millions of years. And then moved off of the continent with lots of other large mammals when climate was changing and the ice age was happening. And this isn't like animals got up and said, oh my gosh, it's cold here and we have no feed, we're leaving. But over many hundreds of thousands of years, that exodus had been happening. And so they were gone from the North American continent for 10 to 12,000 years and returned with the Spanish explorers. There's some nuance there with now looking at them and how we manage them, and I think Steve is right. It's not potentially any agency's job to determine exactly what that means. It's going to take a little more prodding from scientists and really some thought processes behind that, because a lot of animals left during that time and have not returned. Mm-hmm. So it's this square peg in a round hole thing of these horses that kind of started here, came back to here, they're managed as feral livestock, basically. They're not managed as wildlife, and they're not really either of those things.
Well, Greg, let's look at it from just a historical or heritage perspective. What do wild horse and burro, let's not forget the burro populations, really mean to the history and the heritage of the West, or the history and the heritage more specifically of our state here in Nevada?
Well, a lot of people relate to wild horses with the characteristics of the West and also America in general. They're tenacious survivors. They're actually very majestic if you see them out there and they're in good condition. And they also bring the freedom and the strength that many of us respect within the American heritage. And they're a big part of the West and the settling of the West and the history of the United States, and a big part of what we look at today as a cultural kind of a tie to the freedom that the Westerners and also Americans value very dearly.
Gus, the clip mentions this, that the horses and burros are part of a much bigger mosaic that is our public lands. What are some of the other things that are part of that mosaic that we won't want to forget about?
That's the challenge that we have as an agency in charge of managing the animals is we can't really focus just on the horse and burro populations. We have to look at a whole array of other uses and values, and that includes uses like recreation and wildlife habitat, oil and gas mining, local community support, like for the livestock industry, wilderness values, all of those are in combination that BLM manages as a multiple use agency, and try to come up with a balance on how do we do that and which pot gets the biggest piece of the pie. But there's a lot of uses and values out there that the American people love and cherish, and wild horses and burros is one of them that the BLM has to manage.
Celeste, let's talk a little about where then the wild horse and burro population is in place on this land. Then, for one thing, how much land does a wild horse need for roaming, or a herd in this case?
Oh, that's a question you can ask 20 different horse people and get 50 different answers. But depending on the habitat type, obviously, is going to support a different number of whatever sort of animal, fill in the blank. But in general, you're looking at carrying capacity of a landscape. So what is the amount of forage available, water, what's the habitat type, food, water, and shelter is what all animals need. And so it's not a one-off question, and that's, I'm sure, something that Gus is near and dear to, is balancing that on public lands when there are these multi-uses. You're gonna make somebody unhappy.
Steve, so what kind of land are we finding the horses on here, specifically in Nevada? What kind of vegetation are they after? Are they in the mountains? Are they in the plains? Where are they?
All of the above.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they occupy multitudes of habitat that exist in Nevada. And I think for the most part, my familiarity is with the northern half of the state. That's where my experience comes from. And I think across the board, they occupy from the top of the mountain to the bottom of the valleys where they can. And BLM certainly has identified horse herd areas where traditionally the herds have been established, and BLM hopes to manage them in those locales. Much of the state isn't designated as a horse herd area, and so I think sometimes as the populations expand and the horses expand outside of the designated horse herd areas, then that's where we have a lot of the problems.
And let's talk a little bit about the specific laws related to this and why we have these herd management areas. 1971, as mentioned in the clip, is when Congress passed a law that provided refuge for wild horses and wild burros. I'm sorry if that's not the right word, but please explain what is this act? What exactly is it?
So the 1971 law is actually the law that pushed forward the protection and the management of wild horses and burros on public lands. Before that, it was kind of a free-for-all. If you go back and time and watch clips like the Misfits movie or something like that, it was a kind of a free-for-all where people could go out and chase wild horses and burros and claim them for their own and treat them as they wanted. But this actually gave protection and management. And so what BLM had to do was, at that time, first was identify where they were located. Where are wild horses and burros found on public lands? And within those, we had to identify what Steve called the herd areas. And then,
and sorry, Gus, when you say we, is this BLM?
Yes, BLM.
This work?
Yep,
Okay.
BLM and Forest Service. Forest Service and BLM had to identify herd areas or wild horse territories if you're talking about Forest Service.
Yep.
And so the herd areas were the areas in 1971 where the animals were identified. Now, interesting fact is BLM has thousands and thousands of public lands, but we can only manage wild horses where they were found in 1971. And so we have vast array of public lands where even if we wanted to, or some of our groups or organizations wanted to, we can't manage horses on other public lands if they weren't found there in 1971.
Interesting. So then the herd management areas where these horses are contained were based on where horses congregated in 1971. Is that?
Yeah. And so after the herd areas were identified, BLM had to go in and do an analysis process and look at vegetation, water, habitat, property ownership, because a lot of horses that were identified in 1971, turns out those were private horses. And there was a claiming period where people could go in and claim horses. And so management areas are areas within herd areas where BLM felt that they could effectively manage a self-sustaining population of animals.
Greg, I'm wondering, from your perspective, is that something that needs to be maybe revisited or redefined on where these
I think it does, and that's where a lot of the advocate groups lean toward the allocation of what they refer to as an appropriate management level, or an AML, and the number of horses that were allocated in 71. Really, this act was tied to the fact that the horse populations were on a decline down to around 25,000 horses, I think, is what we had on the range. Part of that, again, was based on some of the Mustangers and some of the treatment of the horses. They were being utilized and sold, and so the populations were declining. And so when we established these herd management areas, we were doing so from the history of where the horses were and how many horses were out there. The American Academy of Science questioned the current allocation of AMLs, wondering where the real depth of the science is on how the analysis was done. And we think that there's probably some reanalysis that might need to be done to determine if, with the higher numbers now, if we need to maybe reallocate some of that forage back to, and land back to some of the wild horses. Right now, our horses are existing on about 27 million acres out of about 255 million acres that are available, and out of that, about 155 million are grazing acres. across the entire BLM facility. And that's from the BLM website. They have really wonderful detail in there. And my compliments to Gus and his group for that, because there's a lot of great data on that.
Well, let's test Gus a little bit more then on just the, since 1971, we've seen an increase of horse populations, I understand. What has that increase been like? I hear it's every 4 years it doubles. Is that accurate?
That is. Every 4 years it doubles, every 6 years it triples. I've been in this program a long time, and I've seen populations go up and down and up and down. And it's amazing how prolific these animals are and how they can reproduce. And our own management, it's been proven in the literature that BLM's own management, or our ability to try to manage, we can stimulate these populations to even increase. But we are right now at a higher population than we've ever been since the 1971 law was passed. Right now, our current estimates as of March 1st of 2019 is over 88,000 animals on public lands, and we have an appropriate management level of around 27,000. So we're about 2.5 times over where we legally should be.
And any idea how many of those animals are in Nevada?
Yeah.
50%.
Yep, about 53%.
Of both horses and burros.
Yeah, 53% of that population is in the state of Nevada alone, a huge population of animals in Nevada. Wow. So a huge impact on habitat and the resources of Nevada.
I would assume. Celeste, really quickly, why the increase? Is this just because there aren't any natural predators for horses and burros? Or?
Horses have a very long reproductive range throughout almost their entire lifetime. They can get pregnant and carry a foal to term, and then they can pretty much turn around and they birth that foal, and they have pretty much a 2-week window, and then boom, they're fertile again and ready to go. So they get pregnant a lot, they have foals a lot, and the mortality rate on the range is actually strikingly low. So they are highly fecund, large animals that produce throughout a very long lifetime.
Yeah, very few predators interact with
Nobody's-
horses. I mean, so like mountain lions, coyotes, I mean, they'll get a few when the young are born, but for the most part, when an adult animal is in play, they have very little
I think
depredation.
it's something like, I don't know, it was something shockingly small, like 2 HMAs are managed because of mountain lion predation, and that's it. And they're very small groups of horses.
Yeah, and I think too, in terms of horse increases, we've changed the transition in the program in that we aren't gathering as many horses as we used to. The holding facilities are filled up, and so there's no place to put the horses if they should be gathered from the range. So we're kind of stuck right now.
And something we're going to talk about just in a moment. I want to share one other clip. This is from the Wildlife Society. It's entitled "Horse Rich, Dirt Poor." We're only going to show a small segment of it. For those of our viewers that want to see the entire segment, you can access that on our website. But let's take a look at the clip of what our current situation is right now.
It's going to be 100 degrees, so I think they're going to need water.
Let's see once we get in here. This will be out of the sun.
Yeah, it's pretty well dust up there around the water, huh?
Yeah. A few years ago, I was out here in northeastern Nevada to work on a wild horse project. And I remember waking up and seeing hundreds of wild horses coming in from every direction. Just battling it out for a drink. That was such a transformative experience. And I think in that moment, I developed that curiosity that I think really pushed me as a scientist. There's like at least another 50 that are just walking out of the mountains.
We're back here to really try to understand this whole wild horse situation, and specifically the effects these wild horses are having on wildlife, our public lands, and these ecosystems that we all rely on.
It seems like these horses are coming in from every direction. I mean, do you think this is the only water source?
Yeah, there's probably no other water probably for 5 miles around here.
So what would happen if this spring dried up?
A lot of them would succumb to not having the resources to survive. Nevada has more wild horses than any other state, and yet it's the driest state in the union. So everything is focused around water. You know, the antelope, I don't know if they're, I want to let them come in and get a drink too. The competition exists between user groups, horses, livestock, wildlife. Anytime you're reducing the amount of food on somebody's plate, then things are going to get bad at some point in time.
Nobody wants them to suffer.
Nobody wants them to suffer, They're trying to just live.
Yeah.
And it's us, it's we as humans that aren't acting appropriately and managing the rangeland resources appropriately.
I mean, this should have vegetation.
Oh, it should have, yeah. The abuse and lack of vegetation is just due to trampling. And so we've lost most of those environments just to overuse and had to transition into more of an exotic weed type environment. I mean, you can't give up, right?
Right.
And we've just got to keep charging and speak for those species that don't really have a voice.
Steve, I'd like to start with you after that clip. For one thing, you're featured, and so let's get a little more detail on what you said there. So you said at some point in time, and we're looking at the landscape here, and we're seeing vegetation gone, right? I mean, you're out there. How severe is this in the areas that are these herd management areas specifically?
Well, I think it just depends on the area. I mean, certainly where we have horse numbers way in excess of AML, we see pretty devastating consequences to those isolated spring sources. And certainly on some of these documentaries, you show the worst of the worst so that you can make a point. But having said that, throughout, this was filmed in probably southeastern Elko County, and in that area where we have scattered water sources, I would say most of them look like that, where we have overpopulation sources. I think in that area, the spruce pequot herd is like 1,000% over AML. So it's pretty devastating when you see it, and things are down to mud. And it doesn't even foster, productive environment for horses to maintain a certain health standard there. So.
On the flip side, are we seeing management areas that are very robust and are able to keep up the vegetation and seem to be kind of maintaining that homeostasis, or are we kind of seeing this impact all the way around?
I mean, I can only speak for the areas that I worked in, but as I've always been on BLM as a wildlife biologist to manage livestock appropriately so that we meet standards and objectives that way. In terms of that, as these horse populations have increased in the last decade or so, we started to see some of the abuses that we saw that were originally identified with livestock now come into play with horses. And so horses are taking over as maybe the main causal agent in not meeting standards and objectives in some of these areas, some of these riparian areas. So,
Greg, let's talk specifically about the horses that we saw there featured. Some of the horses don't look as well. You're kind of out in the field too. What's the state of the horses in some of these herds?
Well, in situations like this where the water is limited and the vegetation begins to disappear, the horse body condition starts to drop as well. So you get into a situation where they are less able to roam as far as they need to be able to get food. It's not uncommon when water sources are limited that they get hit reasonably hard by everything that's out there that grazes and uses that water, and that adds to the pressure around the water. So, you have grazing, during the grazing period, you have horses, and it adds up. So when you have that much pressure on very limited sources, then you're going to have that kind of a scene as we've seen there, as well as a reduction in grazing capabilities. They can't graze as much, whether it's cattle or horses. The horses then have to range out further, use more energy to do that, and their body conditions drop.
Gus, I'm wondering how, in the past, and the present. How is BLM then managing this population problem, this increase?
Well, it's actually shifted over the years. There was a period of time when BLM was actually able to, we gathered, we adopted out quite large numbers of animals. We were talking 8,000, 10,000 adoptions a year. But then the adoption level started to drop off. The need to remove animals, excess animals, continued. And now it's actually got to the point that we're looking at a numbers game. It's how much funding do we have and how much space do we have to put excess horses in is the determining factor on how many excess horses we remove. And so we're really not looking as much at the environment, which we should be, other than we're looking at funding and where do we put horses that come off the range.
Right.
And can you define what removal means? When you're removing a horse, where's the horse going then if it's not on the...
Yeah, that's a good question, because time and time again, people bring up that BLM is removing them and sending them to slaughter. And BLM does not send horses to slaughter. I mean, we have 50,000 horses in holding right now. Obviously, we're not shipping horses down to Mexico because we are holding them, and they're either going into an off-range corral, which is more or less a corral facility, or an off-range pasture. And so after they're removed, they're brought to a corral facility, they're prepared for adoption. If we find a home for them, we'll either find a home for them through the adoption process or what we call our sell process. If that doesn't occur and they stay in our corrals for a while, then we move them onto our pastures. And our pastures are more or less a sanctuary where horses are going to live their lives out. They're going to live their life out until they pass away.
I want to present another clip. This one is from Greg's organization, American Wild Horse Campaign. The title of this clip is Join in the Fight. Let's take a look.
Every year, the Bureau of Land Management, an agency within the U.S. Department of the Interior, rounds up thousands of wild horses and burros from our public lands in the West. They are federally protected and live in designated habitats called herd management areas. Unfortunately, they have to compete for their resources with commercial interests such as livestock, oil and gas, and mining. Today, the BLM sets a national population limit of just 16,000 to 27,000 horses and burros on 27 million acres of public land. But in 2013, the National Academy of Sciences completed an 18-month review of the BLM's program and could not identify a scientific rationale behind the BLM's arbitrary population limits.
So to reach that number, every year they round up wild horses and burros en masse. And they do that through a few different means, but the primary one that they use is through helicopter stampede. They run horses for miles at a time. They're running them through really jagged and diverse landscapes. Families are separated, foals are left behind, and we believe that it's a really inhumane way to be managing these animals.
Not only are the population limit numbers unfounded, but also the BLM allocates resources unfairly. The BLM manages 245 million acres of public land. Livestock are allowed to graze on 155 million of those acres, but only share 17% of that with wild horses. And to make matters worse, the BLM gives 80% of the forage to livestock, and wild horses are left with the scraps. The roundups are inhumane, and they're also creating a larger problem. The National Academy of Sciences actually found that the BLM's roundups and removals are causing the wild horses left on the range to breed at higher than normal rates. In other words, the BLM is creating the very problem it's complaining about. The mismanagement doesn't stop there. The wild horses and burros who survive roundups and can't be adopted or auctioned off are sentenced to a lifetime of being warehoused in government holding facilities, or worse, end up in the slaughter pipeline.
Their spirit is broken in holding. There's no way around that. You can't deny it. You can't, yeah, they're still horses and yeah, they're still going to survive, but now they're in holding. You've taken away their freedom. Even if we were to adopt 30,000 horses tomorrow, that just opens up 30,000 more spots for horses to come off the range and go, you know what I mean? So this vicious cycle of the way things are being managed has got to change.
So Gus, I want to come to you first. There's quite a few stats in there. I know we want to respond to that. I wish we could. But let's just start with this. The arbitrary limits is one of the first things that was mentioned, 16,000 to 27,000. You mentioned that was the limit previously. Right. Is that an arbitrary limit? What is the science behind that being the limit of wild horses?
So that's a really good question, because the Wild Horse and Burro Act of 1971 has been amended 4 times over history. And one of those times, it was through the Federal Land Protection Management Act of 1976. And that required BLM to do a land use planning process. And in that land use planning process is where BLM is charged with going in and analyzing those appropriate management levels and looking at all the other uses and values and coming up with that value. And so I wouldn't call them arbitrary, but one of the things that the BLM is charged with is they need to be relooked at. We've actually had appropriate management levels that have increased over time, and as environmental conditions change, we need to be looking at those AMLs. Maybe need to go up and maybe need to go down, but I wouldn't call them arbitrary.
Right, and the public has input on that.
Exactly.
When we go through the land use planning process.
That's a big charge of that. That's really what I look at as the primary charge. It's the public input that drives those.
And Greg, Celeste, what's data on some of the research that you've done on what is a healthy population? Is that it be a lot bigger than they are right now, Celeste?
Well, AML as a tool, I think, is incredibly useful and necessary. You can't, again, dependent on what your habitat type is and what's happening with the environment at that moment, that's going to drive different numbers. Maybe what was appropriate 20 years ago is not going to work now. And vice versa. And to sort of lay it out flatly is like, oh, this is wrong. There's a lot more that needs to go into it. And I'm afraid right now that kind of at this tipping point that you've referred to in the intro, it is going to be a hard process, and it's going to be tough on people. The conditions on the range right now aren't great, and we are rolling into some pretty big, dramatic climate change outcomes. And water is already an issue on our public lands, being as most of it is originating on private lands, and then now there is even less of it. So what do we do about that? It does mean we're going to have to reanalyze, and those choices aren't always going to be up, but they are sometimes going to be up. And I think it's contingent upon the BLM to keep making that process happen and to keep making those public commenting periods as transparent as possible, and to make sure NEPA is deeply involved in that, even though everyone complains NEPA slows everything down. But we have got to be careful about
Celeste,
how we look at this.
NEPA, what is NEPA?
Now I'm going to get it wrong. National Environmental Protection Policy Act. Right. So that anything that's occurring on public lands has some sort of environmental review on many levels before it's enacted.
Steve, let's talk about horses. I keep leaving burros out. We can't leave burros out here. But let's also talk about livestock too. When we're talking about impact of vegetation and what you're seeing on the lands, is there a difference between a horse and livestock for one?
Well, it depends on what kind of livestock. So with cattle, probably not. They're both grazers, and so they take the same type of forage, mainly grasses. And so there is competition between the two over certain species of plants. Wildlife typically are browsers, so they go for the shrubs, as do domestic sheep. So there's a little bit of overlap there. But there's competition out there, and we have, since you mentioned a little bit in the start of the thing about other issues that are coming into play, energy production, energy transmission, urban development. We're talking about competition between horses and wildlife and livestock, but there's a whole array of other things that are coming in and impacting the ability of those resources to make a living out there on the range.
Gus, how does BLM manage something like that? That's so many other interests. Again, this mosaic question comes up. Yeah. We're talking about industry. We're talking about ranchers that have been on that land, using that land for a long time too. How do you prioritize?
You just have to go through the public process. You have to, because there are areas you can maybe emphasize one program or another. But when you're around, like Las Vegas, for example, you have a large population base here. You have a huge recreational aspect here, and so that's a huge part of the public land management in and around the Las Vegas area. So that might take some emphasis, but you're still going to have all those other uses you have to look at. and managed as a public land agency. And you know, it's a balancing act, but it's needed to have the public input, and what the public would like to see out there will drive that process.
Let's go back to the clip again and address the inhumane factor of some of these roundups.
Great.
Are they inhumane?
In my opinion, you know, I've been in this about 30 years now, and I've seen BLM do some pretty poor job at times over history in gathering horses, but I think we've learned a lot. I think as an agency, we've got a comprehensive animal welfare program now, and we've learned, hey, wow, we can't do this and we can't do that. We've got some great pilots right now, and we've got some great contractors. We haven't been perfect over the years, but I think that the way that we're doing them right now is the most humane way that they can be done, but it needs to be monitored. You can't just turn your back on and let it just a free will go about it. Yeah, they have to be monitored, you have to keep them in check, but I think that BLM does a really, really good job, and humanely take credit. You know, I was on all of those gatherers that was in that video, and no, we didn't run horses for miles. No, we didn't separate foals from their mothers, and you know, I kind of take offense to some of that. It was brought up for the dramatic of it, but I think BLM's doing a great job now.
Well, Greg, let's hear your viewpoint.
I think,
have they evolved? Have they gotten more humane?
BLM, I think, is actually doing a better job hiring better contractors, and so as a result of that, the humane care of the gatherers have improved. The nature of the gather is that you're putting horses that are used to being in open space in a confined area, so there is going to be potential for accidents and catastrophes,
definitely.
And we'll see that, right? So there is going to be some bad things that happen when you do that. But there are alternatives that the Bureau's also been open to, and I'm thankful of, and that's the bait water trapping and doing things that are less invasive on the actual animals themselves, where they're not contained in such tight quarters and run, you know, not necessarily for miles, but you know, a helicopter's a pretty scary thing to a wild horse. And no matter where they go, they can't get away, right? So ultimately, we have a ways to go, but I think the direction is improving. And I think overall, if we could avoid doing gathers, that would be great, and managing the horses on the land.
We're already talking about solutions, so let's move into solutions here. You mentioned water trapping. What is water trapping compared to just a normal roundup?
What's interesting, in Nevada, one of the things that we have that's always limiting out on the range is water. It's especially noticeable during the summer months. July and August, we had a really great wet year this year, so we have puddles and we have little areas where water's pooled, and so the horses are able to move around. When horses are running out of water, they congregate in areas like we saw within the film, and it makes them open to be able to go into certain areas that we can trap them and close the corrals and either, you know, do things that would help with fertility control or gather them if there's too many, but it's a much more benign way of capturing horses and taking them off the range, if indeed that's the direction, or at least applying birth control.
You mentioned fertility control. We want to show our final clip here too. This is a continuing clip from the exact same short that we just watched, Join in the Fight. Let's take a look at that clip, please.
So there are currently a few alternative methods that the BLM could be using. They could be implementing humane and safe fertility control that can be administered through remote darting on the range, and that keeps family bands wild and free and together.
I definitely believe PZP is by far the best thing that we have available right now to help control these herds in the wild. Helicopter gathers are certainly hard on horses, and that certainly affects their wild behavior. I do not want to see horses rounded up, but I get why it happens. And we're trying to do everything we can to keep that from happening, and that's why we're out administering contraception to these horses. We want to see this herd continuing to thrive and living how, you know, nature made them.
The PZP vaccine has a decades-long history of being used to humanely manage many wildlife species, including wild horses. The vaccine creates an immune response that prevents fertilization. It does not affect hormone production, and that's why the impact on natural behavior is very minimal, especially when compared to the alternatives like surgical sterilization. Wild horse and burro management needs to be responsive to the public. After all, these are our public lands, and Americans strongly support protecting wild horses and burros on them. Wild horses symbolize the things that make our country great: survival, freedom, and the untamed spirit of the American West.
I hope we can protect them for years to come. The land they live on, the way they live their lives, I hope that we can make a difference in making sure that their lives matter.
Please join us in the fight to protect these national icons.
Getting a little bit emotional with that last clip, with everything we've talked about, and seeing the impact. It's amazing. Celeste, let's talk about fertility control here. Is this the answer? Is this something we can do?
My favorite subject.
And reduce the populations?
It's certainly part of the answer. It's a big part of the answer. And I don't know if we're ready to go into the sort of multi-pronged thing yet, but there are limitations to fertility control, and I think there's been a sort of misaligned sort of movement to just go out, just use fertility control, and we can do it. And if we could, great. We're not there yet. We may be there. I think the technology and the research is going to begin to catch up to us, and we're going to be in better shape. The vaccines we have available to us now need to be boosted every year. That's a problem.
What are some of the barriers I mean, is it a physical barrier of just trying to get to that many animals?
Yeah, if you were going to make an appreciable difference to the population of animals overall, you would need to dart about 35,000 mares. We're not going to go out on foot and dart 35,000 mares.
What's the rate we're doing on an annual basis now?
Several thousand, maybe. And I mean, I plug and chug data all day. Nobody likes it, but someone's got to do it to actually look at what's feasible. How much does it cost? What can we get away with? How long does it take? And what you find out doesn't really make you happy, but it does give you some hope. And that to implement a fertility control program that would effectively stabilize your population, and this is without considering what an appropriate AML is or not, but that would take a very, very long time, and it would require about 35,000 mares out of the population receiving a fertility control vaccine.
Yeah, just the logistics. I mean, even when you're talking a wildlife population and trying to inoculate a wildlife population, I mean, the logistics of trying to do that and do that time after time after time, it's very difficult.
Logistics and cost. You mentioned cost.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Gus, let's talk about cost on something like this. If we're looking at fertility control, rounding up and containing horses, I'm assuming there's a high level of cost for BLM for something like that. How do those costs compare?
Well, if you're just looking at the fertility control cost, it's, you know, to actually treat that many animals, I mean, we're talking about a large number of increase in staffing. Right now, there's only about maybe 10 herds that BLM is effectively darting and treating. And if you were to actually implement and try to do a lot of this, it probably isn't feasible because a lot of these horses can't be approached, and you can't dart them. So that means you'd have to do a helicopter gather, which people don't like, and so then you're bringing in that stress factor from a helicopter gather. The cost of doing a helicopter gather, holding them horses, and then releasing them, then to think about having to do that again next year and every year, that's just not feasible. And so those costs are kind of overwhelming.
And Greg, let's talk about where a nonprofit community might come in here. BLM can't do it. I mean, is there a big enough system or network of darters to be able to kind of take a chunk out of that, or is this still unfeasible?
There isn't a big enough network yet, but there is some growth within the networks to certify people to dart. And the volunteers are becoming more prevalent, and that gives us a lot of resources that are near urban areas. What we run into is when we have a very remote location, we have a situation where, like Gus was saying, it's hard to get to the horses because they'll run off, or you have to drive all day to get to the location, and so it becomes a bit difficult for us to apply. One of the things that I looked at and have talked to a number of ranchers is that they're out on their ranch, they're out on their allotment every day. They have hands that are on those ranches every day, and they've shown some interest in potentially helping us. All we need is the NEPA or the EPA documents to support the PZP, and we probably will be able to bring on even more volunteers outside of just volunteers for an advocate group, but people that actually have skin in the game that actually will benefit from their ranching by keeping some control of these population growth.
But we're at a point now where, I mean, PZP is just one tool in the toolbox that we have. I mean, we have to look at
And
other.
can we define what PZP is? So is that the actual drug for fertility control then?
That is one of the immunocontraceptive vaccines available that can be remotely delivered and that people can be certified to give. And it's certified through the EPA to be delivered to wild horses.
Gotcha. Please, Steve, continue.
No, I think it's a part of the puzzle, but it's certainly, we can't hang our hat totally on inoculating horses and reducing, fecundity rates.
But I have a plan.
You've mentioned multi-pronged numerous times. We're going to get to that.
Celeste for president.
I have a diabolical plan.
We want to hear it.
But I want to come back to this because it seems like kind of just an obvious choice. Why can't we expand the herd management areas? Is that going to impact, Steve? You're out there.
Well,
is that going to does that take care of the problem here?
No, it doesn't. I think, like we talked about, it's a public process, and we can expand.
I think we're past that.
Areas. Yeah.
I think we're past that because our populations are so huge now. We're at 88. We're over 88,000 horses. They've already expanded outside the herd management area. They're outside the herd areas. They're on public lands where they're not legally there. So we're way beyond even where you're mentioning ongoing. I mean, that's the problem we're facing right now. Is we are so overpopulated. We have to really pull that back and then look at some of the stuff that Celeste is talking about, the PZP, the Gonacon, these different tools.
And even if we got back into the gatherers arena, we don't have right now any holding facilities that can take that number of horses that would need to be removed on the range over a period of time to get back to where we probably should be in balance.
We've surpassed the number. You also have to look at what's realistic. And so you can say, oh, well, let's gather down to whatever number. Let's say we had magical holding facilities everywhere. Gather and remove, gather and remove, gather and remove.
It's not the answer.
Forever it will be. I mean, we've seen 40 years of that happen. We have reams of data showing what happens to a population when you're removing some subset, leaving the remainder out on the range, still with the same relatively high reproductive rate for a large ungulate. So we've addressed nothing. We've done a short-term solution in one area or on one herd management area for 3 to 5 years, and then it's back up to a number that is considered excess. So it's the flat circle.
Let's get away from the flat circle then. Let's go to long-term solutions here, and let's talk about multi-pronged approaches here. What do we have on the table? We've talked about fertility control. We've talked about expanding lands, which is an option. Roundups, right? We've briefly talked about adoption. We need to address that. Mm-hmm. Put all those together. Is that the plan? What do we do here?
Well, just put all those together, sort of on steroids. We've been analyzing what happens when you layer in some of these approaches. If you just went out now today and implemented fertility control, even at relatively high amounts, the population is still going to grow. It won't flatten out for a very, very, very long time. If you just gather and removal, as we know and has been proven, it also continues to grow. And so, unfortunately, you have to do both of those things along with several others. And so you do have to gather and remove, but, and this is new, I mean, it's not new, you have to implement robust fertility control alongside those gather removals. Now, this has been difficult for the agency to grab onto because there's no resources for that. If you were going to do that, that means gather, treat, release, which nobody wants, but it might just have to happen because we may get to a point where we just have no other choice.
And why does nobody want that? Is that back to the humane?
You're putting, nobody wants gathers with helicopters, but let's leave that off the table just for right now. And just there are, if you're trying to reduce your number of animals in any particular region, but part of your plan is that you're going to have to put some back out after you've gathered them. That's not always popular. But let's set that aside as well. If you're gathering and removing some amount, you're gather, treat, releasing some other percentage, and this would have to be determined on an HMA by HMA basis. You can't do it over the whole thing. It's different in each place. Then you also need to beef up your adoption program, which is happening right now in BLM. They're reaching higher numbers than they have certainly in the past 10 years. But you might need some partners to help out with that instead of just a federal agency that's a resource land management agency now suddenly told now you have to adopt animals out. Well, who has that expertise? And then we're also going to need to beef up the long-term holding facilities that are available. There have not been facilities available in the West, but the BLM just, I think, wrapped up an RFP process, a request for proposals for facilities in the West. And if you were to implement all of those, if you did them pretty successfully, which will require a lot of money, in 10 years you would have stabilized that population, gotten it certainly closer to what right now is considered by the agency to be an appropriate management level. And at year, I think it's at year 4, 5, or 6 now, I can't remember, but you would actually begin, initially, obviously, your horses that are in holding are gonna go up, but then they would begin to drop, with the ultimate goal being that we don't need or want long-term holding ever again, but we won't reach that for many, many years, and that we are beginning to phase in more robust fertility control on the range, partnered with the projects that can be hit by these nonprofits that are field-based, starting alongside gather, treat, release.
Gus, is that possible? Is that plan possible? We're talking about a lot of cost, obviously, a lot of man and woman power, just for the BLM alone.
My wheels are spinning, and I hope Congress watches this and they realize we need to have about another $50 million, because that's what it's probably going to take. I mean, we are an agency that has an $80 million budget. This program, when I entered it, we had a $17 million budget, and now we're at 80 plus. But in order to do the real on-the-ground work that needs to be done, we need to have dollars, because we need to open up a lot more off-range pastures. We need to open up corrals, because so last year we were very actively in gathering horses, removing horses. We removed just under 12,000. Well, all of our corral facilities are full right now, and so we're not doing any removals right now because our facilities are full. And so we need to get that infrastructure in place so that we can implement what Celeste is talking about.
Yeah.
Greg, let's talk about...
Thank you very much. I've been patiently waiting to add my 2 cents.
Please do, please do.
What I've seen, and I've been fortunate enough to have worked with the Bureau of Land Management in '78 at the Palomino Valley Corrals, which was the premier location for adoptions. And I saw how much adoption went out of there back then, and they'd line up for almost a mile, trucks and trailers. That's gone. And we're making really good efforts to bring some of that back. But what we've always done is we've gathered and we've held and we've tried to adopt, and then we've gone out 6 years later and we've gathered again. Part of what's missing in this is consistency on the population control. And I emphasize that because if we go out there and we take it down to low AML, and we don't do anything about it until 6 years, we're back up to a point where we have all these animals. They've responded per the Academy of Science saying, okay, well, we got a lot of food now, let's have some babies. And as a result of that, we have even more population, so we end up digging a deeper hole. And I want to mention budget, because it's really critical to what the BLM faces. Right now, 2/3 of their budget goes to holding and to hay. That leaves 10% for adoptions, that leaves 7-8% for gather, that leaves 20% for admin, and less than 1% right now. 700 and some horses have been treated for birth control in 2018. There's the gap. That's where the issue lies, is consistency.
Community-based sector here. I mean, can we fundraise outside of the BLM and raise the money to be able to close some of that gap, first off?
Definitely can. Increasing habitat, increasing volunteers, increasing awareness, making an effort to try and get consistency out there, bringing in, it takes an army. You know, there isn't going to be the BLM be able to do it. They don't have the resources to do it. They don't have the budget to do it. And they probably aren't going to get it. They need probably 20 range cons in a district to be able to go out and dart all these horses.
Well, Greg, how do we get the public involved then? How do we mobilize that amount of people?
The public can volunteer through the local advocate groups, and they can actually, the advocate groups will help them be trained on how to administer, whether it's PZP. You know, the thing that we are looking at is, you know, I mentioned the bait water trap. That's an opportunity where you set a trap up, they walk in, they drink a drink of water, they're darted, and off they go. And they can do that every year. You know, there isn't, the issue with helicopter treatment is it takes $3,000 to bring that horse into that corral if you got to use a helicopter. Yeah. Now granted, some of these areas you're going to have to do that because they are so remote, or you're going to have to gather still and utilize that same technique. But the bottom line is we have to shift the way we do things and not do what we know doesn't work. And that is the same thing that we did back in '71. Back then it worked. We had 8,000, 9,000 adoptions, right? As a result of that, we could keep up. The population was probably 40,000 on the range. Now we got double that. Right. And our adoptions are about 4 grand.
But can we get our act together as a society and join together and get it done?
That's a different show.
Right, because we're on a
set some things aside.
Well, we're on a precipice now in terms of habitat condition.
And unfortunately, that is another show. We are out of time. And I want to mention just really quickly, a lot of the resources that you mentioned will be on our website, so please check out our website. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time. It was a great discussion. And thank you, as always, for joining our discussion on Nevada Week. We're going to continue this discussion on our Nevada Week Extras, so please visit our website to view this continuing conversation, or watch this episode again, or access resources like the full videos that you saw on this show. Also, if you have a topic or issue you'd like us to explore on Nevada Week, we'd love to hear from you, so please find us on social media or email us at nevadaweek@vegaspbs.org. Thank you again, and I'll see you on the next Nevada Week.